Most books fade. You read them, you enjoy them, and then they're gone. A few months later, you can barely remember what they were about. But some books don't do that. Some books stay with you, sometimes for years. They sit in the back of your mind. They change the way you think. Or they just keep pulling you back. This video is about those books. It started as an answer to a question for my 4,000 subscriber Ask Me Anything. My top 5 classics and my top 5 not classics. But it turned into something else. Because this isn't really a list of the best books. This is a list of the books that stayed with me. Let's take a look. Hi, this is Cams of Cams Campbell Reads. Welcome to my channel. This was going to be part of an Ask Me Anything video to celebrate my 4,000 subscribers, but as I was recording it, I realised it was going to be too long, so rather than include it in the Ask Me Anything, I'm going to make it as a separate video, which I think works much better, and I'm just going to do a short listing in the Ask Me Anything. So these two things go together hand in hand. Let's get into it. Got a question from GRSDV, and he asks, this might be a cliche, but I'd like to know your top 5/10 books, maybe top 5 classic and top 5 contemporary literature. So straight away I'm into terms, definitions, what's contemporary literature. So what I've done is I've broken it down into classics and everything else, excluding non-fiction. So this is all fiction. Let's start with the classics, shall we? First up, I've got The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This one here, this is the Peverin Volokonsky translation, which was my original copy actually. I then went on to read the Michael Glennie translation, and this became my primary copy for a long time, Every Man's Library. This is the one I was reading when my mum died, which makes it significant in my life. And I recently did a read-along for my Substack, which you might have seen on YouTube as well, for which I also got the Burgeon and O'Connor translation. And this cover just beats them all. Penguin Deluxe Classics. I mean, is that not just gorgeous? And it contains the famous line, manuscripts don't burn, rukopisy nie горят in Russian. And the other famous line on the other flap, follow me reader, za mной читатель. So this book follows the story of the devil coming to Moscow in the 1910s or 20s. We're getting into Stalin's time, and it was written over a period of like 25 years. Bulgakov died and he was still editing it in 1940. The book wasn't published until 1966. So he never got to see it published, and it was thanks to his wife, who was an inspiration for the character of Margarita, that it came to light. So yeah, it's a remarkable book. It was a difficult one when I read it the first time. I didn't really get it, but then that's the case with most of these classics. You know, I read them as a younger man, obviously, and I'm not sure I was ready for them when I first read them. But now it's a firm favourite, and I've probably read this one 4 times now, and I will read it again, there's no doubt about it. Why is it in 5th place? Because the other ones are even better. And what might they be? My beloved Oblomov by Ivan Goncharov, written in 1859, and it follows the story of Ilya Ilyich Oblomov, who's a young aristocrat with land which produces income, and he's basically in a state of meaninglessness, lack of purpose. He can't get off the sofa, he can't get out of his dressing gown, no matter how he may wish to, which he does. He just can't seem to do it. This very comic relationship with his manservant, Zachar, which is hilarious, And he also has a really good friend who's been a friend of his since his childhood, Stoltz, who's half German, half Russian. So he kind of straddles that line between Russia and Western Europe. It's kind of like part of the story is looking at the kind of place where Russia is geographically speaking. It's kind of half Asia, half Europe. And his Oblomov's dressing gown is of Asian extraction, and he's kind of that way, like, oh, I'll just lie on the sofa and everything will be all right, you know, whereas Stoltz is very, oh, let's get to work, let's get things done. And so that leads to a little bit of friction, which is interestingly portrayed. And then there's a love interest. So he falls in love, Ilya Ilyich, with a woman called Olga, and that gets him off the sofa briefly. It's a fantastic novel, criminally overlooked. I don't know why it's not considered as much as Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, you know, the big famous Russian classics. So definitely recommend it. This was the copy I had as a student. This is the one I would have read back when I was a student in 1993/4, when I was in first year. And it was one of the first books I read for my university degree that I actually got first time. I loved it from the get-go. So I don't know if that tells you something about me or about the book, or both. Probably both. What's next? Right, I ummed and ahed over whether this was a classic or not, and so I spent some time researching what is meant by classic, and this one ticked the boxes. So here we go. Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake. This is the first of the Gormenghast trilogy. This was my original copy, which is, it's got some pages coming out. I've since bought another old copy which I found in a used bookshop, a much earlier publication. Oh, it smells so good. I love the smell of old books. This was £1, so how could I not buy it? Penguin Modern Classics. And then more recently I got this beautiful single volume which contains artwork by the artist, by the author. So for example, here's some artwork. So this is a Gothic, I hesitate to use the word fantasy because that was put down as a reason why it's not considered a classic, because it's genre fiction. I'm going to push back against that. It's not genre fiction in the sense that fantasy or sci-fi or mystery would be. I think this is classic literature in the sense that it stands above genre, I would say. It's in its own place, along with, it's in the pantheon of classics. I'm going to put it there, and you can fight me. The writing is exquisite. The story, the characters, the relationships, the grotesquerie of the scene, of the setting, is just delectable, absolutely delectable. So one of my all-time favourites, and I picked the first one because it's the first one. I didn't do that going forward, but that's why it's Titus Groan and not Gormenghast. Next up I've got The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I read this on Kindle. I've got this compendium edition, which I haven't read yet. I got this from the same used bookshop as I got Mervyn Peake, Titus Groan. £2. I mean, what a bargain, right? But I read it on Kindle, so I've got the cover there. This is a Penguin Classics. I remember reading this for the first time in 2010 when I was at work and I ran the local post office, and I would read this sitting through the back on my lunch break, and it just blew me away. Massive surprise for me came when I learned the main character's name. The main character, of course, being Tom Joad, because I'd been playing Bruce Springsteen's The Ghost of Tom Joad on the guitar for a long time without knowing who he was. So, yeah, what a surprise. It's a novel that I've read twice and I would dearly like to read again. However, I've got East of Eden on my list before that. In fact, it was on my list for last year and I didn't get to it. So this year, I'm hoping that I will. East of Eden could have taken the slot, but for the fact that I read Grapes of Wrath first and The Ghost of Tom Joad, you know, it's just, what a novel, what a novel. Finally, you've probably guessed already, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is the Anthony Briggs translation, which is my preferred translation. This is one that I read as a student, so this is my student copy. Look at that old book. Bought from a used bookshop in St Andrews where I did my degree. I've still got some notes in there from when I was a student, which I love. And this was published in 1943. So this is the Maud translation. And it's quite different actually. But also a very good translation. Much more so, I would say, than Pevere and Volokonsky, who are not my favourite translators. So bear that in mind. In fact, what I should have said when I was talking about Master Margarita is that my preferred translation, the primary copy that I used for my read-along, was the Hugh Aplin translation. But there is another one as well, which I listened to, which is also very good and highly recommended as an audiobook, by Carpelson. So there are many translations, but I'm going to go with Aplin or Carpelson, I think. War and Peace, though, it's, for me, it's kind of the ultimate comfort read. I read it with Simon Hazel 2 years ago on his Substack, where I learned that he was doing it a chapter a day and that you can read the book in 1 year, a chapter a day, and it only takes you 10 minutes a day, 10, 15 minutes to get through it, because the chapters are super short. And he was putting out fantastic supplementary materials, and that's what kind of inspired me to start doing my own slow reads, because I loved what he was doing and I saw it was rewarding for him as well as for his readers. So, I mean, why would I not? And so I am. And I'm doing it again this year. I'm reading it again. This time, the English translation first. So I start every morning sitting with a cup of tea, read a chapter of War and Peace in English, and then I follow up by reading it in Russian, because I want to get my Russian back to a reasonable level. Again, you know, having let it atrophy for such a long time. So that's the classics. Let's move on to the not classics. Right, let's take a look at the top 5 not classics. So the first one I've got is Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb, and that's in a box. I've packed it away because we're moving. So it's the third book of the Farseer trilogy, and I read it for the first time in 99, I think. When was it published? Have I got that on my Substack? Yeah, 1997 it was published. And I bought it in 99 at a little bookshop in Wadebridge in Cornwall. On my first trip to Cornwall when I was visiting my wife's family. And it just blew my mind. I've picked the third book in the trilogy because of the ending. And I did make a long video about this, so I won't go into it too much. You can go and watch the other video if you want to learn about how the magic system really was the catalyst for my philosophy of life, the universe and everything. Creativity, higher power, which led into my sobriety from alcohol. It's a whole thing, and Robin Hobb is responsible for kicking that off and changing my life. Yeah, I would go so far as to say that. So I couldn't not have Robin Hobb on the list, and Assassin's Quest, because the ending just blew my mind. Next up, I've got Stephen King, It, of which I don't own a copy. I must have at one point, but yeah, I don't know what happened to it. I think I read it for the first time round about, let me think, I was just out the army. after my accident. So it would have been about 1990, 91, maybe 92. And it was actually recommended by a friend. And at that point, I had read The Dark Half, which was my first Stephen King. And then it just grabbed me, you know. Stephen King's writing still does that. And it was the relationship of the kids, you know, the way that they defeated a monster in their childhood, bonded them in such a strong way, and then they come together 27 years later, having forgotten each other, which is a little plot twist that I quite enjoyed. And when they come back together when the monster comes back, and they come together again to fight the monster again, and the monster, oh my God, imagine your scariest, the thing that gives you the most amount of fear, the monster takes that from your mind and becomes that. And you might not even know what your scariest fear is, but whoa. Yeah, it freaked me out. I've read it, I think, 3 times now, and yeah, it's just such a phenomenal novel. Particularly when I read it at the first time, you know, what would it have been, 1920, something like that. It was so powerful. Okay, moving on to my favourite fantasy series of all time, which is Stephen Donaldson, another Stephen, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. So I would have read that for the first time about the same time. I was in the army, accident, late teens, early 20s, and just discovering Thomas Covenant for the first time. I'd say it's the first kind of adult fantasy that I'd read, because up until then I'd been reading like David Eddings and Terry Brooks and, you know, more young adult, I would say, fantasy. Moving on to this was adult. You know, there's a scene in the first book which is definitely an adult scene. And to meet Thomas Covenant for the first time, what a horrible guy. But for some reason I just related to these books so well. I've read them many, many times. I've made a podcast about the first one with a good friend of mine, Barge, who'd never read any fantasy before, and we went through Lord Foul's Bane, which is the first of the first Chronicles. Why did I pick the middle book of the second Chronicles? I guess it's my favourite of them all. You'll see there's a ship on the front there. They leave the land and they go off to an island where the one tree grows so that they can fashion a new staff of law. And yeah, just the giants whose ship it is that they travel on, they are some of my favourite characters in fantasy, particularly Saltheart Foamfollower. If you've read the first Chronicles, you'll know Saltheart Foamfollower is one of the best characters in any fantasy. You know, fight me on that. For some reason I can relate to Thomas Covenant, even though he's loathsome, and it's the way I think that he fights his own despite, and that's the word that Donaldson uses, despite. It's like self-loathing in a sense, which becomes externalised as the enemy. And it's, yeah, just the redemption arc in both sets of Chronicles. And in the final set, there are 10 books in all. The last Chronicles came out much later. I think, when was the One Tree? Willow's getting in my way here. Beautiful though she is. Yeah, the One Tree was 1982. I think the first book was written 1977. So they're old, but they stand up. I think they stand up well. So definitely recommend Stephen Donaldson if you're a fantasy lover. And for some reason, he's criminally overlooked. Brandon Sanderson's the guy now. Go back and read Donaldson, you know. That's all I'm going to say about that. Next up, I've got How Late It Was, How Late by James Kelman, which is a book I read as a student. I was just back from Odessa, let me see, 96, something like that. I read his book called A Disaffection when I was in Odessa, and I discovered it at the British Council Library. I'd never heard of James Kelman, and I loved The Disaffection. It's a phenomenal book. How Late It Was, How Late, I think is slightly better. And it follows the story of the bold Sammy, a young Glasgow Jakey, an alcoholic, down and out kind of guy in Glasgow who's got a big heart and he's struggling with life. He's having to navigate the bureaucracy of the DHSS, which is the Department of Health and Social Security, which, is it still called the DSS now? I don't know, but that was to whom you would apply for benefits and stuff like that. And dealing with the bureaucracy of all of that. I mean, I can remember that. I was around at that time. The DHSS was a behemoth. I mean, it's still a behemoth and difficult to deal with. So, yeah. It was written in the Scots language, and it's, in a sense, inaccessible in some ways for people who don't know Scots. But for me, you know, that's my language. I grew up speaking Scots. I studied it for my master's degree, and it's set in Glasgow, which is kind of my area. So, you know, there's just so many relatable things for me with this book. It won the Booker Prize, I think. Would have been 95, something like that. I think his Disaffection book was nominated but didn't win, and this one did win. I should read it again. I can't show you it because it's in the loft, but yeah, fantastic read. Last up, A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving, which I do have. A hardback, naked hardback that I just bought used because it's my favourite book, and I didn't have a copy. I've only listened to it on audio. Excellent narration, by the way, on Audible. Can't remember who did it. I should have looked that up beforehand, but you can do that. It follows Owen Meany, a little guy with a high voice. And there's a reason for the high voice. It comes in later on in such a beautiful way. Oh. But it follows John Wheelwright. He's the narrator. New England, as all John Irving's books tend to be. And John Wheelwright becomes a teacher. But we start off at school when they're kids, and he and his pal Owen Meany are on a baseball field, and Owen Meany scalps a ball and fires it off, and it hits John Wheelwright's mum and kills her. You're like, whoa, what an opening. You know, this is quite early on in the book, right at the beginning. And so we follow the story of the relationship between these two kids as they grow into adulthood, and how this death, you know, infiltrates the relationship in weird ways. And it's so well written. The characters are so deep and believable, and the relationship, you know. And then the ending, just, all I'll say is have a box of tissues when you're reading it, because the ending's just exquisite. And I would recommend, if you're going to read it, it's a good book to read sort of November, December time, particularly because it gets into a wee bit of the festive season, and there's a Christmas Carol play where Owen Meany plays one of the characters, and it's such a great scene. So those are my 5 top non-classics. As of today, of course, they might be different tomorrow. If I were to come up with this list again, who knows what I would come up with. Prayer for Owen Meany was published in 1989. So I think the most recent book in my list, 1997, Robin Hobb is the most recent. So what does that tell you? I don't know. It's just a little data point. So there you go.